The pilots collapsed at 37,000 feet. 300 passengers. No communication with the ground. And the only person who could possibly save them was a 17-year-old girl in seat 14C who'd never flown a real aircraft. The flight attendants had served her apple juice like any other teenager. The businessman beside her had dismissed her completely when she tried making polite conversation. Nobody knew that in 2 hours, aviation authorities worldwide would be calling her emergency landing impossible. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Maya Chin pressed her face against the airplane window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly below like a white ocean frozen in time. At 17, she still felt that same flutter of excitement every time a plane lifted off, even though she'd spent the last 2 years obsessively studying everything about aviation. Her worn backpack sat wedged under the seat in front of her, crammed full with flight manuals, simulator logbooks, cockpit procedure guides, and a tablet loaded with hundreds of hours of instructional videos she'd watched until she could recite them from memory. She was traveling alone from Seattle to New York, a graduation gift from her parents who'd saved for months to give her this trip. Her mother had held her tight at the airport security checkpoint, tears in her eyes, telling her to be safe and call the moment she landed. Her father had squeezed her shoulder and said with a knowing smile, "Remember everything you've learned, Beta. Knowledge is never wasted. You never know when it becomes the difference between life and death." Maya had laughed and hugged him, thinking he was just being his usual dramatic self, never understanding that those words would echo through her mind during the most terrifying and extraordinary hours of her young life. The flight attendant came by with her beverage cart, offering drinks with that practiced airline smile that never quite reached the eyes. She handed Maya a can of ginger ale without really looking at her, already moving on to the next passenger. To everyone on Flight 2847, Maya was just another teenage girl, probably listening to music and scrolling through social media, heading to New York for shopping or sightseeing. The attendant had no idea that the quiet girl in the faded jeans and oversized Aviation Academy hoodie had spent countless nights studying commercial aircraft systems, that she'd memorized emergency procedures for scenarios most passengers never even imagined, that she'd logged over 600 hours in flight simulators practicing everything from routine approaches to catastrophic emergencies. Maya wasn't just interested in flying. She was consumed by it, obsessed with it in a way that made her different from other girls her age. While her classmates were at football games and parties, Maya was in her bedroom with her homemade simulator setup, practicing instrument approaches to airports she'd never visited, memorizing the location of every switch and circuit breaker in a Boeing 767 cockpit, studying aerodynamics and weather patterns and air traffic control procedures. Her friends thought she was weird. Her teachers encouraged her passion but gently reminded her that simulators weren't real flying, that all her studying would need to be supplemented with actual flight hours and proper training. And Maya knew that. She understood perfectly well that despite all her theoretical knowledge, despite her hundreds of simulator hours, despite her ability to recite procedures from memory, she wasn't actually a pilot. She was just a high school student with a dream that seemed impossibly far away. She was just a 17-year-old girl who loved airplanes more than anything else in the world. Nothing more, nothing less. Flight 2847 was a Boeing 767, and the moment Maya had seen it at the gate, her heart had skipped with recognition. The 767 was her favorite aircraft to study, the one she knew better than any other. She could recite its specifications without thinking. Wingspan of 156 feet, length of 159 feet for the 200 series, typical cruise speed of Mach 0.80, maximum range of over 6,000 miles depending on configuration. She knew that it used a 2-pilot glass cockpit with digital displays, that its fly-by-wire systems made it more forgiving and stable than older aircraft, that its autopilot was sophisticated enough to handle most of the flying if properly programmed and monitored. She'd spent so many nights flying this exact model in her simulator, practicing normal operations and emergency procedures, learning every system until the cockpit layout was burned into her memory. But sitting in seat 14C now, sipping her ginger ale and half listening to a podcast about aviation history, Maya never seriously imagined she'd need any of that knowledge. She was just another passenger on just another routine flight, one of 300 people making the unremarkable journey from the West Coast to the East Coast, trusting completely that the 2 experienced pilots in the locked cockpit would deliver them safely to their destination. The middle-aged businessman in seat 14B was absorbed in his laptop, typing away at what looked like urgent emails, his expensive suit jacket folded carefully on his lap. When Maya had tried to make polite conversation earlier, asking if he traveled often, he barely grunted a response before turning back to his screen, clearly not interested in chatting with a teenage girl. The woman in seat 14A was reading a thick thriller novel, occasionally glancing out the window at the clouds. Behind Maya, a young family was struggling to keep two small children entertained with coloring books and tablets. Across the aisle, an elderly couple sat hand in hand, their eyes closed peacefully as they dozed. Everyone was lost in their own private worlds, completely unaware of each other, trusting in the routine safety of commercial aviation. The flight had been smooth so far, nearly 2 hours of peaceful cruising at 37,000 feet with nothing but endless blue sky visible outside. The captain had made one brief announcement after takeoff, his voice calm and professional, informing them that they'd be arriving in New York right on schedule with good weather and light winds. Everything was perfectly normal, perfectly routine, exactly as it should be. Then Maya noticed something that made her aviation instincts suddenly alert. The flight attendants who'd been casually moving through the cabin, collecting trash and offering snacks, suddenly clustered together near the front galley. Their body language had changed completely. They were speaking in urgent whispers, their expressions tight with worry. One of them kept glancing nervously toward the cockpit door. Another pulled out what looked like an emergency procedures manual, flipping through pages with hands that Maya could see were trembling even from several rows away. Maya pulled out her earbuds, her full attention now focused on the crew. Something was wrong. She'd studied enough about aviation to recognize the signs of a developing emergency. The way the senior flight attendant was speaking rapidly into the interphone. The way another crew member was checking passenger manifests. The way they kept looking at the cockpit door with expressions that mixed fear and confusion. Then came the announcement that would change everything, that would transform Maya from an anonymous passenger into the only hope for 300 lives. The voice that came over the intercom belonged to Carol, the head flight attendant, a woman in her 50s who'd been serving passengers with professional efficiency throughout the flight. But now her voice was different, tight with barely controlled fear despite obvious efforts to sound calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency with our flight crew. If there are any licensed pilots on board this aircraft, please identify yourselves to a flight attendant immediately. This is urgent. The cabin erupted in confused murmurs that quickly escalated to worried conversations. Medical emergency with the flight crew? People began looking at each other with growing alarm, the implications slowly sinking in. Maya's heart began pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. A medical emergency with the crew could only mean one thing, and that one thing was every passenger's worst nightmare. The pilots were incapacitated. She watched with growing dread as the flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, scanning faces desperately, stopping to speak quietly with passengers, asking questions that were met with head shakes and apologetic looks. 3 minutes passed, then 5, and no one came forward. No off-duty airline pilot happened to be on board. No military aviator was traveling that day. No one with actual flight experience was available to help. The fear in the cabin was becoming palpable now. Passengers were whispering frantically, some were crying, others were pulling out phones to send what they feared might be final messages to loved ones. The businessman beside Maya had finally looked up from his laptop, his face pale as he realized what was happening. Carol's voice came over the intercom again, and this time she wasn't trying to hide her desperation. Please, we need anyone with any flight training or aviation experience. If you have any knowledge of flying aircraft, any experience at all, we urgently need your assistance. Please identify yourself immediately. Maya's hands were gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Any flight training. She had training, sort of. More than 600 hours in high-end flight simulators. 2 full years of intensive aviation study, everything from basic aerodynamics to advanced aircraft systems. She'd memorized the entire Boeing 767 operations manual just because she found it fascinating. She'd practiced emergency procedures until she could execute them in her sleep. But she wasn't a real pilot. She was just 17 years old, just a high school girl with a hobby that some people thought was weird. She'd never actually flown a real airplane, never felt actual controls in her hands, never been responsible for anything more serious than a simulated emergency that she could pause or restart if things went wrong. The woman in 14A was crying now, her thriller novel forgotten on her lap. Behind her, Maya could hear the mother trying to comfort her frightened children while her own voice shook with terror. The elderly couple across the aisle were holding each other, their faces reflecting the fear everyone was feeling. Maya took a deep breath and unbuckled her seatbelt. Her hands were shaking but her mind was surprisingly clear, falling into the analytical patterns her aviation training had taught her. She'd studied for this kind of scenario, not because she ever expected to experience it, but because she'd studied every scenario she could find. She knew procedures. She knew systems. She knew what needed to be done, at least in theory. And right now, theory was all anyone had. "Excuse me," she said quietly to a passing flight attendant who looked close to panic. "I've had flight training." The young woman turned to her, and for a moment Maya saw hope flash across her features before doubt replaced it. "You're a pilot?" "No," Maya admitted, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her heart raced. "I'm not licensed, but I've been studying aviation seriously for 2 years. I've done extensive simulator training on this exact aircraft type, the Boeing 767. I know the systems and I know emergency procedures." Carol appeared beside them, summoned by the other attendant, and when she saw Maya standing there, 17 years old and looking even younger in her hoodie and worn sneakers, her face fell with disappointment. "How old are you, honey?" 17. "But I know this airplane. I've trained on it extensively in professional-grade simulators. I've studied the system's manual, the emergency procedures, everything." "Simulators aren't the same as real flying," Carol said, though her tone was pleading, almost begging Maya to convince her otherwise, to give her a reason to hope. "I know they're not," Maya said quietly, looking directly into the older woman's frightened eyes. "But right now, I'm the closest thing to a pilot you're going to find on this plane." Carol looked toward the cockpit door, then back at Maya, then around at the cabin full of terrified passengers, and Maya saw the moment when desperation overruled every doubt. "Come with me. Quickly." As Maya followed Carol toward the front of the plane, she felt every eye in the cabin tracking her movement. She heard the whispers that followed her down the aisle. "That's just a kid. Is that girl really going to fly us? Oh my God, we're all going to die. She looks like she's in high school." Maya forced herself not to look back, not to make eye contact with any of them. If she thought too hard about the weight of what she was about to attempt, about the 300 lives that were depending on a teenager with simulator experience, she knew she would freeze completely. At the cockpit door, Carol used her emergency override code to unlock it. When the heavy door swung open, Maya's worst fears were confirmed in the most visceral way possible. Both pilots were slumped unconscious in their seats. The captain's head rested at an awkward angle against the side window, and the first officer had collapsed forward onto the center console. Soft warning chimes were sounding, indicating that various systems needed attention that the unconscious pilots couldn't provide. "What happened to them?" Maya asked, stepping carefully into the cramped cockpit space, her eyes already scanning the instrument panels just as she'd been trained to do. "We don't know exactly," Carol said, her voice breaking slightly. "About 25 minutes ago, they both complained of severe headaches and dizziness over the interphone. Then they just collapsed. We think it might be carbon monoxide poisoning or some kind of toxic fume event from the air system." Maya's mind immediately jumped to her emergency training. Fume events were rare but serious, often caused when contaminated engine bleed air entered the cabin systems. If the pilots had been exposed to something toxic, she needed to make sure she wouldn't suffer the same fate. "We need to maximize fresh air circulation immediately. Have someone open all the overhead air vents in the cabin to full flow. And I need supplemental oxygen." Carol nodded quickly and rushed away to give instructions. Maya stood in the cockpit doorway, taking in the scene with a strange mixture of terror and focused calm. This was the moment every simulator session had unknowingly been preparing her for. This was why she'd spent so many nights studying when she could have been doing normal teenage things. She looked at the 2 seats before her, at the hundreds of switches and digital displays that she'd memorized from diagrams and videos, at the control yokes sitting in their neutral positions. This was completely real. This was actually happening. 300 people were depending on her, and she'd never actually flown an airplane outside of a computer simulation. Maya took several deep breaths, forcing down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her, and sat carefully in the captain's seat. It felt different from her simulator chair at home, more solid, more real, the weight of actual responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Her hands hovered over the controls without touching anything yet, her eyes moving systematically across the instrument panel just as she'd been taught. The autopilot was engaged, maintaining level flight at 37,000 feet, following the flight management system's programmed route toward New York. That was good. That gave her time to think, to assess the situation, to figure out her next steps. The aircraft was stable, flying smoothly, all systems showing normal on the displays. She had time. Carol returned with a portable oxygen bottle and mask. Maya put it on immediately, taking several deep breaths of clean oxygen to clear her head and protect herself from whatever had affected the pilots. Then, with hands that trembled only slightly, she reached for the radio headset and put it on, remembering the emergency frequency procedures she'd memorized. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite everything. "This is Flight 2847, Boeing 767, both pilots incapacitated. I am a passenger with extensive simulator training attempting to establish emergency communication." For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds, all Maya heard was static in her headset. Then a male voice responded, professional and urgent. "Flight 2847, this is Seattle Center. Confirm both pilots are unable to perform duties." "Confirmed," Maya replied, falling into the precise language she'd learned from studying ATC communications. "Both pilots are unconscious and unresponsive. Suspected toxic fume event. I am a passenger with simulator experience on the 767. I need immediate guidance." There was a longer pause this time, and Maya could imagine the shock and chaos her transmission must be causing in the air traffic control facility. A teenage passenger trying to fly a Boeing 767 with 300 people on board. It was unprecedented, impossible, the scenario that controllers trained for but never expected to actually face. "Flight 2847, what is your name and age?" "My name is Maya Chen. I'm 17 years old, but I've logged over 600 hours on high-fidelity 767 simulators. I know the aircraft systems and emergency procedures." Another pause, probably while the controller consulted with supervisors and made emergency notifications. "Okay, Maya. I'm Controller Davis. Listen to me very carefully. You are not alone in this. We are going to walk you through everything step by step, and we're coordinating with every expert we can reach. First, I need you to confirm that autopilot is engaged and aircraft is stable." Maya scanned the flight control panel, verifying each mode and display just as she'd practiced countless times. "Autopilot engaged. Altitude hold active at 37,000 feet, heading 090 degrees, airspeed 490 knots. All flight director modes are active. Aircraft is stable." "Excellent, Maya. That's exactly what we need to hear. Very well done. Don't touch any controls yet. The autopilot is keeping you safe. Now, what's your current fuel state?" Maya found the fuel quantity gauges on the overhead panel, showing approximately 44,800 pounds remaining in tanks. "Copy that. You have plenty of fuel, more than enough. Maya, here's what's happening right now. We're coordinating with Boeing's emergency response team, with senior 767 training captains, with everyone who can help. You're going to have a team of the best aviation professionals in the world guiding your every move. But I need you to tell me honestly, can you do this?" Maya looked at the unconscious pilots beside her, then out through the windscreen at the endless sky stretching in all directions, then down at her 17-year-old hands resting near the controls. She thought about all those nights in her simulator, all those procedures she'd practiced, all that knowledge she'd absorbed not because she had to but because she loved aviation with every fiber of her being. She thought about her parents waiting for her call, about the 300 people sitting in the cabin behind her who were trusting someone, anyone, to get them safely home. "Yes," she said simply, with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. "I can do this." What Maya didn't know was that her Mayday call had set off alarm bells throughout the entire North American aviation system. Emergency protocols were being activated at multiple facilities simultaneously. The FAA's crisis management team was being assembled. Boeing's Technical Emergency Response Unit was mobilizing. Senior airline captains were racing to air traffic control centers. News organizations were picking up the story from aviation radio scanners, and within minutes the entire world would be watching. And in that moment, sitting alone in a cockpit at 37,000 feet with 2 unconscious pilots beside her and 300 lives depending on her, Maya Chen took on more responsibility than any 17-year-old should ever have to carry. The next 75 minutes passed in a state that Maya would later describe as hyper-focused calm. The autopilot continued to fly the aircraft smoothly while she worked through a comprehensive systems check with Controller Davis, verifying every gauge, every indicator, every warning system, exactly as she'd learned in her training. Hydraulic systems all showing green, normal pressure in all 3 systems, Maya reported, her eyes moving systematically across the displays. Electrical systems nominal, both generators online. Cabin pressurization holding steady at 8,000 feet cabin altitude. Engines running smoothly, exhaust gas temperatures and fan speeds all within normal parameters. "Outstanding work, Maya. You're doing everything perfectly. Now we have Captain Sarah Morrison here. She's a senior 767 captain with United Airlines, over 15,000 hours of flight time. She's going to help guide you through the approach and landing. Maya, I'm putting you over to Captain Morrison now. A new voice came through Maya's headset, female and authoritative but also warm and reassuring in a way that made some of the tension leave Maya's shoulders. Maya, this is Captain Morrison. I understand you've been studying my favorite airplane. Yes, ma'am. The 767 is incredible. It certainly is. I've been flying this aircraft for 13 years, and I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to land it safely. But first, I need you to understand something important. Landing is going to be the most challenging part of this whole situation. We're not going to rush it. We're going to take all the time we need, we're going to do everything methodically and carefully, and I'm going to be with you on the radio for every single step. Can you follow my instructions exactly as I give them? Yes, ma'am, I can. Good. Now, tell me about your simulator experience. What kinds of scenarios have you practiced? Maya thought back through countless hours in her home cockpit setup. I've practiced standard approaches and landings, single-engine scenarios, hydraulic failures, electrical malfunctions, manual reversion flying, crosswind landings in various conditions. I've flown approaches to maybe 60 different airports in different weather conditions. Excellent. Have you practiced any single pilot operations? Maya hesitated, knowing the truth might be discouraging. Some, yes. But most commercial flight training scenarios assume two pilots working together. That's completely fine. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to break down every single task into small, manageable steps. You're going to focus on one thing at a time, and you're not going to move forward to the next step until I tell you to. Nothing happens until I say so. Understood? Yes, ma'am. Understood. Perfect. First major decision. Where are we going to land? You're currently over Montana, about to cross into North Dakota. Looking at your route and our options, Denver International is about 200 miles ahead on your flight path. They have the longest runways in the region, weather is clear and calm, and they're already preparing for your arrival. That's where we're taking you. Maya felt a small surge of relief. Denver. She'd practiced approaches to Denver International dozens of times, attracted by its long runways and interesting high-altitude challenges. She knew the airport layout, the runway configurations, the approach procedures. It wasn't completely foreign territory. Behind her in the cabin, word had spread throughout the aircraft about who was sitting in the cockpit. Some passengers were crying quietly, others were deep in prayer, and many sat in stunned silence trying to process the reality that a teenage girl was going to attempt to land their aircraft. Parents held their children close. The elderly couple Maya had noticed earlier were holding hands so tightly their fingers had gone white. And somewhere in the middle of the cabin, other teenagers traveling alone were probably thinking about how they'd feel if they were the one in the cockpit right now. Carol and the other flight attendants were doing their absolute best to maintain calm, walking the aisles with reassuring words, though their own faces showed the fear they were trying to hide. One passenger, a man in his 40s, had demanded to know if there was really no one else who could fly the plane, suggesting that surely anyone would be better than a teenage girl. Carol had firmly told him that Maya was their best and only option, and that everyone needed to trust her. And in the cockpit, wearing borrowed oxygen and sitting in a captain's seat she'd only ever seen in training videos, Maya was doing her best to be worthy of that trust. Maya, Captain Morrison's voice brought her back to focus. In about 40 minutes, we're going to begin our descent into Denver. Before we do that, I need you to understand what you're going to experience. When you disconnect the autopilot for the landing, the aircraft is going to feel heavy and powerful in your hands. It's going to want to pitch up and down, roll left and right. Your job is to make small, smooth corrections. Don't overcorrect. Think of it like driving a car on ice. Everything happens more slowly and you need to be gentle with your inputs. Small corrections, gentle inputs, don't overcorrect. Got it? Good. Now, I want you to very lightly rest your hands on the control yoke. Don't move it at all. Just feel it. Feel what the autopilot is doing to maintain control. Maya placed her hands carefully on the yoke, and immediately she felt the subtle movements, the tiny adjustments the autopilot was constantly making to keep the aircraft perfectly stable. It was alive under her hands, responsive and powerful, and feeling it made everything suddenly more real. I feel it, she said quietly. It's making constant small corrections. That's exactly right. That connection is crucial. You need to understand how the aircraft moves. Now I want you to look outside and tell me what you see. Maya looked through the windscreen at the view that had captivated her for her entire life. The endless sky stretched in every direction, impossibly blue and clear. Far below, the landscape was a patchwork of fields and forests. The horizon curved gently at the edges of her vision. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Captain Morrison's voice softened slightly. "It is, isn't it? That view is why we do this job, Maya. That freedom, that perspective. You're about to join a very exclusive group of people who truly understand what it means to fly. Are you ready?" Maya thought about all the time she'd dreamed of sitting in this exact seat, of having real controls in her hands, of actually flying instead of simulating. She'd never wanted it like this, never wanted the enormous weight of all these lives depending on her every decision, but here she was. This was her moment, terrifying and real. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "All right. In 10 minutes we begin our descent. I want you to start mentally reviewing your procedures. Landing gear extension, flaps configuration, speed management, thrust control. Tell me the basic sequence." Maya closed her eyes and visualized the landing sequence she'd practiced so many times it was burned into her memory. Descend to traffic pattern altitude following ATC vectors. Configure aircraft progressively with flaps at assigned altitudes. Extend landing gear below 10,000 feet and verify 3 green lights. Establish final approach configuration with full flaps. Maintain precise airspeed and glide path. Touch down in the touchdown zone on centerline. Deploy thrust reversers immediately. Apply brakes smoothly. Perfect. Absolutely perfect, Maya. Now let's make it happen for real. The next hour became a masterclass in precision flying, with Maya following Captain Morrison's instructions exactly while Controller Davis managed her routing and altitude clearances. Step by methodical step, they brought Flight 2847 down from cruising altitude. Maya, begin descent to flight level 280. Set vertical speed to 1,500 feet per minute descent. Maya's hands moved to the autopilot controls, adjusting the altitude selector and vertical speed. Descending to 28,000 feet at 1,500 feet per minute. The aircraft's nose pitched down slightly, and Maya felt the change in engine tone as the power reduced for descent. Behind her, passengers felt their ears pop with the pressure change. "Beautiful, Maya. How does the aircraft feel?" "Stable. Responding exactly as expected." "Outstanding. Continue descent." At 25,000 feet, it was time to begin configuring the aircraft for landing, and Maya knew this was where things would start getting more complex. "Maya, extend flaps to position 1. The lever is on the center console." Maya's hand moved to the flap lever, and she moved it deliberately to the first position. Immediately, she felt the aircraft's characteristics change as the trailing edge flaps extended slightly. A gentle buffet ran through the airframe and the speed began to decrease. Flaps 1 extended. Speed decreasing to 280 knots. "Perfect. That's exactly right. Continue descent to 18,000 feet. Denver Approach Control had cleared all other traffic within a 100-mile radius, creating a vast protected airspace for Flight 2847. Every controller in the facility was monitoring Maya's progress, and in the tower, emergency vehicles were positioning, preparing for any possible outcome. At 12,000 feet, Maya could see Denver in the distance, the city spreading across the plains with the Rocky Mountains as a dramatic backdrop. The airport was a geometric pattern of runways and taxiways, and she felt her heart rate increase as the moment of truth approached. "Maya, extend flaps to position 5. Flaps 5. Maya moved the lever, felt another change in the aircraft's behavior. "Now I need you to extend the landing gear. This is important, so listen carefully. The gear lever is on the center console. When you move it down, you're going to hear a loud rumbling sound and feel significant vibration as 3 massive wheels extend. The nose is going to want to pitch down sharply. Be ready to add power to compensate." Maya's hand hovered over the landing gear lever. This was one of those moments where simulation and reality would feel very different. She took a breath and pulled the lever down into the extended position. The rumble was immediate and dramatic, much louder than in any simulator. Maya felt the entire aircraft shudder as the landing gear extended and locked into position. The nose dropped and she saw the altimeter start to show an increased descent rate. "Add power, Maya. Push the throttles forward just a bit." Her right hand moved to the throttle levers, pushing them forward about an inch. The engine tone increased and the nose steadied. On the landing gear panel, 3 green lights illuminated. "Gear down, 3 green lights," Maya reported, pride creeping into her voice despite her nerves. "Beautifully done. You're a natural at this. Now let's bring you home." At 6 miles from the runway, with Denver International's massive complex of 6 runways spreading out before her like a detailed map she'd studied many times, Captain Morrison gave the instruction Maya had been both dreading and anticipating. Maya, it's time. You need to disconnect the autopilot and take manual control. The autopilot disconnect button is on the yoke where your thumb rests. Maya's thumb found the button. This was the moment everything changed. Once she pressed this button, there would be no computer helping her, no safety net, no way to pause if things went wrong. Just her, the aircraft, and 300 lives. She pressed the button. A soft chime sounded, and suddenly the control yoke came alive in her hands with a presence she'd never felt in simulation. Every tiny movement she made translated directly into the motion of a 180-ton aircraft carrying precious cargo. She made a small correction, felt the wings respond, adjusted her grip. You've got it, Maya. You're flying. Now let's talk you down. Check your airspeed. Showing 175 knots. Perfect. Extend flaps to 30 degrees. Maya's hand moved to the flap lever, extending them further. The aircraft slowed and became more stable, settling into its landing configuration. The runway was ahead now, a long strip of concrete that looked impossibly narrow from her altitude. But Maya had done this before, hundreds of times in her mind, and her hands moved with growing confidence. 1,000 feet altitude, Captain Morrison's voice was steady and calm. You're perfectly on glide path. Maintain 155 knots. Maya's eyes moved constantly, scanning between instruments and the visual picture outside, between the numbers telling her what the aircraft was doing and the physical reality of descending toward Earth. 500 feet. You're doing beautifully, Maya. At 50 feet, I'm going to tell you to flare. That means gently pulling back on the yoke to raise the nose and slow your descent. The runway was rushing up now, growing larger with every second. Maya could see the touchdown zone markings, could see emergency vehicles lining the taxiways, could see the reality of what she was attempting. 200 feet. 100 feet. 50 feet, Maya. Begin your flare now. Gentle pull back. Maya's hands moved smoothly, pulling the yoke back, feeling the nose rise, the aircraft transitioning from descent to that perfect moment just above the runway. The ground was right there, and then the main landing gear touched the runway with a gentle chirp of rubber on concrete. Maya held the nose up for a moment, aerodynamic braking, then let the nose wheel settle onto the pavement. Without hesitation, her hands moved to deploy the speed brakes and pull the thrust reverser levers. The roar of the reversers filled the cockpit as the massive engines redirected their thrust forward, and the aircraft began decelerating rapidly. Maya's feet found the rudder pedals, keeping them perfectly aligned with the center line, and her hands moved to the brake pedals, applying smooth, progressive pressure. They rolled down the runway, speed bleeding away, and finally, 3,000 feet from where they'd touched down, Maya brought Flight 2847 to a complete stop. For a moment, there was absolute silence on the radio. Then Captain Morrison's voice came through, thick with emotion. Maya Chin, that was a perfect landing. You just saved 300 lives. Maya sat back in the seat, her hands still on the controls, and tears began streaming down her face. Behind her, the cabin erupted in cheers, sobs, and applause that shook the aircraft. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds, and paramedics rushed aboard to treat the unconscious pilots, who would fully recover after treatment for carbon monoxide poisoning. As Maya finally stood up from the captain's seat, her entire body shaking with released adrenaline, Carol threw her arms around the teenage girl who'd saved everyone. You did it, she sobbed. You beautiful, amazing girl, you did it. As Maya was led from the cockpit into the cabin, every single passenger rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Tears streamed down countless faces. People reached out to touch her, to thank her, to tell her she was a hero. The elderly man who'd been so skeptical grasped her hand with both of his and said, "Young lady, you gave me more years with my grandchildren. Thank you doesn't seem like enough." Within hours, Maya's story had exploded across every news outlet in the world. Television networks showed footage of the 767 landing, played audio of her calm communications with ATC, interviewed aviation experts who were calling her achievement extraordinary, unprecedented, miraculous. Her name was trending on every social media platform. People were calling her a hero, a miracle worker, an inspiration. But sitting in a quiet room at the Denver airport, finally able to video call her parents who were sobbing with relief and pride halfway across the country, Maya didn't feel like any of those things. She just felt grateful. Grateful for every night she'd spent in her simulator when she could have been doing something else. Grateful for every procedure she'd memorized. Grateful for every approach she'd practiced. Grateful that when it mattered most, she'd been prepared. Captain Morrison came to see her before she left the airport. She shook Maya's hand firmly, looking her directly in the eyes and said, "Maya, I've been flying professionally for 20 years. I've trained hundreds of pilots. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what you did today was extraordinary. When you turn 18, you call me directly. I will personally ensure you get into the finest flight training program in this country." 3 months later, Maya Chin stood before her entire high school at graduation, delivering the commencement speech about her experience. She talked about the unexpected value of passion and preparation, about never knowing when your interests might become life-saving skills, about trusting yourself even when the situation seems impossible. "People call me a hero," she said, looking out at the sea of faces including her beaming parents. "But I want you to understand something. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who loved something so much that I studied it obsessively. I practiced when I could have been doing easier things. And when the moment came when people needed me, I was ready." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I learned that day at 37,000 feet is this. The passions you pursue, the knowledge you gather even when others don't understand why, the skills you develop simply because you love them, those things matter more than you can imagine. You never know when the world will need exactly what you've been preparing for your entire life." Years later, Captain Maya Chen would taxi a Boeing 767 away from the gate on her first flight as a fully licensed airline pilot. Sitting beside her would be a seasoned captain, and the passengers behind them would be trusting 2 trained professionals with their safety. But Maya would always remember her first real flight, the one where she sat alone in the cockpit at 17 years old, responsible for strangers she'd never met, guided only by her love of aviation and her determination to never give up. And when young people would ask her for advice about pursuing their dreams, she'd smile and say what she truly believed. Love something so deeply that you study it when no one else understands why. Practice so much that it becomes part of who you are. Because someday, when the impossible happens and everything is on the line, your passion might be the only thing standing between disaster and miracle. The story of the 17-year-old girl who landed a passenger jet alone became legendary in aviation, a reminder that heroes aren't always the ones with the most credentials or experience. Sometimes heroes are simply the ones who are ready when they're needed, who prepared through passion, who were capable of the impossible because they never stopped believing in themselves. And every time Captain Maya Chin sat in a cockpit, whether as a student or instructor or eventually a senior captain herself, she remembered the feeling of that control yoke coming alive in her hands, the runway rising to meet her, and the moment when all her dreams and training merged into one perfect landing that saved 300 lives and changed her own forever.